before coffee. A man ought to be left alone when he takes his tea. A man ought to be left alone when he's in the shower. A man ought to be left alone to take a nice long pee. Man ought to be left alone when he's been drinking. A man ought to be left alone when his thoughts is done. A man ought to be left alone when he says, boys, I'm headed on. Man ought to be left alone to play with his Jhon. 'Cause if you don't leave that man alone, there's bound to be a fight. But go ahead, kiss the bear, just don't be surprised when it bites. Man ought to be left alone, do just as he please. Leave that man alone so he can be free. A man ought to be left alone during meal times. A man ought to be left alone in between. A man ought to be left alone when he's talking. A man ought to be left alone to count his green. A man ought to be left alone when he makes whoopee. A man ought to be left alone when he's pumping gas. A man ought to be left alone when he's got a woman in his home. Man ought to be left alone to wipe his ass. 'Cause if you don't leave that man alone, there's bound to be a fight. But go ahead, kiss the bear, just don't be surprised when it bites. Man ought to be left alone, do just as he please. Leave that man alone so he can be free. A man ought to be left alone, grow his hair wild. A man ought to be left alone to be bald. A man ought to be left alone when he's pissed off. A man ought to be left alone when he's lost his dog. A man ought to be left alone when he's been drinking. A man ought to be left alone when he crawls home drunk. A man ought to be left alone when he's crying on the phone. Man ought to be left alone when his ship's been sunk. 'Cause if you don't leave that man alone, there's bound to be a fight. But go ahead, kiss the bear, just don't be surprised when it bites. Man ought to be left alone, do just as he please. Leave that man alone so he can be free. You better leave that man alone so he can whack it in peace.